Welcome to a webinar on Quaker Social Change Ministry. I've done this webinar before, but I've done it usually as just one 90-minute session and not one that taught both the spiritual practice and the accompaniment practice as different and distinct parts. So I'm glad you're able to join me, and hopefully we'll be able to join next week. This webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to access it. Excuse my cat. You'll be able to access it afterwards. We'll send you the recording. I'll show you where to find the recording so you can share it with other people as they get involved. So this is a webinar on a practice that that AFSC has been promoting and trying to spread for a little while, that I believe is really great at bringing mystics and activists together, grounding our social change work in collective, community, and in accompaniment practice, and understanding accompaniment as a foundational spiritual practice, and as a way to sort of disrupt the systems of oppression in an overt and clear way. So we're going to be talking about that. So we're going to get started. So I want to start with something that's sort of elementally a part of the practice. In this practice, what you're trying to do, it's very, very hard to bring about a kind of justice that you want to, that we want to create in the world without having some lived and embodied experience of that. And so part of the idea of this practice is that with a small group, you kind of practice in a really intentional way the alternative that you're trying to bring about in the world. And you also, and that's a process of consent, and that you work together with the group to determine what that looks like, what you need from each other in order to create justice and a sense of justice and a sense of beloved community with each other. So what I'd like to do first, and this will be also a way to include those of you who are on the phone, is I'm gonna ask a question, and I'd like you to raise your hand in the way that Diana just showed you. And if you're on the phone, you can just unmute yourself and jump in. There aren't that many people on the phone. But I'd like you to think about the question, what would you need from a group of people in order to feel as though you were creating beloved community together? This is kind of like a guidelines process or a shared agreements process, but I like the inclusion of the concept of what we're up to is trying to create the beloved community together. So if folks would be willing to raise their hand. If you really prefer not to raise your hand, you could use the chat. I'm looking at that too, but it'd be lovely to hear your voices. And if you raise your hand and I call on you, you can unmute yourself. You can turn on your video if you like, and just say your name and then your response to the question. So is there somebody who'd like to start? Great, Mary Finn, go ahead. Unmute yourself. Turn on your camera if you like, and tell us what you would need. I think you're still muted, Mary. So
can you hear me?
Yeah.
This is the first time I've ever tried this. So
well, I'm impressed. You're doing fine. So go ahead.
Well, my name is Mary Finn, and I'm a member of the Buffalo meeting, Buffalo, New York meeting, and we have a racial justice circle, and I'm hoping to learn something I can take back to our group, because we really need to know how we can communicate our feelings about justice and incorporate it into the group experience with people in our community that we don't usually communicate with. I guess that's the bottom line.
Great, wonderful. So what would you need in order to feel as though you were creating beloved community with other people that you're working with?
What would I personally need?
Yes, what would you personally need?
For the hmm. Well, to me, it's a matter of communicating the love of others, to really make people feel that I'm honestly sharing, figuring out how to turn what I feel into kind of an articulate way of expressing that to people.
Okay, great. So you need some love and some sense of safety so that you and others could share honestly. Great. Okay.
That's good. Yes, thank you.
Margaret, go ahead. Unmute yourself, and if you want to turn your camera.
Yeah, I'm Pen Nosek from Houston's Live Oak Friends meeting. I would need to have a shared commitment to change. So if they're not willing to change, it would be very difficult to create a beloved community.
Great. Okay, great. A shared commitment to change and a shared purpose is what I hear behind that. Wonderful. Thank you. Are there others who would like to share? I saw somebody raise their hand and then put it down. Once you've done sharing, go ahead and put hit the button again so your hand gets lowered so I don't call on you twice. But I'd love to hear from other folks. If you feel more comfortable putting your response in the chat, feel free and then I'll just read it. But Karen, go ahead.
Hey, I'm Karen Bush, and I go to a Mennonite church west of Philly. I think in order to feel like you're building a beloved community together, there obviously has to be trust and acceptance as well, in order to feel that you can speak in a transparent and an honest way.
Great. Trust and acceptance. Wonderful. Also, both of you on the phone, if you really want to chime in, you can press *6 and that'll unmute you and you can join the conversation if you like. Anybody else want to share? Oh, Joseph, go ahead. I saw your hand and then it disappeared, so go ahead. And you said you're with Chatham Quakers, wonderful, and that solidarity is really important. I really appreciate it because that's basically what this is all about. This model is really all about solidarity. Solidarity with your local Quaker or other congregational community and walking with other people so you're really providing them with a sense of solidarity. Looks like there's somebody on the phone.
Oops, I wanted to say something.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say regarding solidarity, like right now we're at this point in American history where there's these folks who are rallying around a kind of solidarity of hate, and the solidarity that I want to rally around is love.
Wonderful, wonderful, thank you. Great. Michael, you have your hand raised, go ahead.
Hi, so I'm actually Ginny Reardon, Mike Triddle's.
Hi, Ginny. Hi, Ginny. Go ahead.
So I really, those other friends speak my mind talking about honesty and solidarity. And I guess I also would be good to have a group that was willing to take some risks that and perhaps that would happen in the sharing, but that also in terms of envisioning a beloved community that may be different than the one that we've been sort of creating together. It's like stretching ourselves.
Yeah, great, great. And yeah, I think that's so important, and a willingness to take risk and kind of sometimes put yourself in an uncomfortable position so that you really need it. You learn and you grow. So Kristen has said in the chat, I would need helping and caring and openness. Yeah, a spirit of like mutual care, and that we care about each other, an openness to different perspectives, an openness to different needs, I think is really, really critical. I agree with that. Ted said that from Buffalo, said that he would need a sense of trust. Yeah, really, really, really important. And trust is something that is given, and it's also earned. And so the process of like really establishing a sense that, for me, trust is like the foundation of a working relationship, and that and trust needs to sort of continually be renewed and built. I've been working with a small collective, and when there's a conflict, we really need to excavate that conflict and look at it really deeply and reconnect. And what we found is that when we do that, the conflict actually is a real opportunity to build deeper trust and connection.
Lucy, this is Sarah Keeney.
Hi, Sarah. Good.
Yeah, in Albuquerque on the phone. I may get on the computer soon, but you know, this is all reminding me that for me, it's an acceptance that, and an understanding that we will have conflict, and kind of maybe an advance agreement that we'll walk through it together, and as you said, excavate it, or do whatever it takes to figure out what's going on and keep our solidarity through the conflict.
Great, wonderful. Yeah, I think that's really, really, it's really important. It's also understanding that you're human and that conflict will happen, and that conflict is an opportunity for like heat and fire that's transforming, that can really bring people closer together. So Suzanne, I see the other things that people said, but I'm going to skip to Suzanne because she's speaking about conflict. She said she would need some agreed upon process or standards of conflict resolution, a real practice so people know what to do. Somebody, Ron has said trust, acceptance, and solidarity. And Martha has said systemic change, a need for thinking about systemic change. And so the Wiz 3 said, I would need a sense of being needed that would give me value. So a sense that your presence is important and valuable and essential to the process. That's really, really great. Thank you. Joseph said, conflict is about unheeded feelings and unmet needs. It usually is. It's about, the conflict that I've recently experienced is about assumptions, or like assumptions about how people will behave, or assumptions about what's the level of communication that's needed. And that what I found is that when that kind of thing happens and you're able to really examine it. I mean, I had an experience recently where the person I was in conflict with was so good at going into the detail of the dynamics of the interaction and describing it and calling me in to deeper accountability. It was really, really powerful because I could say, oh yeah, I see that, I can change that. Somebody said, Bob said being seen is important. All right, wonderful. These are really wonderful reflections. And this process is really the beginning of the group formation, that you have this conversation with one another as you're gathering together, and you talk about what it is that you need from each other in order to be feeling like you're creating the beloved community or a just community together. Another piece that was kind of mentioned in terms of the conflict is a sense of transformative justice, that when there's some kind of wrong that's done, we work together to come back together and heal. Really appreciate all of these. We're going to talk about this a little bit more later in the presentation. If you already have raised your hand, if you can lower your hand, and if you're on the phone and you're unmuted, if you could remute, which is another *6 on the phone, that would be helpful as we move forward. All right, thank you so much. So I'm going to start by reading a poem which came to me in Meeting for Worship kind of all at once. And for me, it's really exemplifies the core of what it is we're trying to do with this model. These photos are, I used to live in a Quaker cemetery, and these photos are my photos of that Quaker cemetery. It's called A Prayer for the Coming of the Light. The snow is melting, the air is crisp. I sit in meeting for worship, notice the ticking of the clock. A siren screeches, the benches creak, bodies situate themselves, resting their bones, taking a breath, waiting. The noise revs up in my head, the to-do list, the moments I said the wrong thing, the news of a friend's illness, the awareness of all the walls we erect to keep what will heal us out. I let the clamor go by, I settle. Underneath the din, I reach the interior, I exhale and feel the sorrow. For the pain of the lost city, for communities denied love, for ancestors with hearts of stone, for all the armor that must fall away for peace. My heart races, I stand and speak, my voice shakes. Hold still, feel the turbulence of creation. The old world is crumbling. The light is on the edge of slumber. Lend your hands to the labor, midwife, the spiritual birth. I sit, still shaken, my heart lies down, a hush encircles us, a sparrow trills outside the open door. So for me, what we're trying to do is midwife the spiritual birth of a renewed and transformed world. And that takes our intentional and participatory effort. And it doesn't mean that the spirit isn't going to crack open and be there, but that our midwifery and our participation is essential to that process. And that is about spiritual centering and grounding and being in community with each other, but it's also about taking the risks of faith, taking the risks of reaching out, taking the risks of walking side by side with somebody, so that you are enacting you're helping them to enact their vision of justice. And so for me, that's really a core piece of what it is we're trying to do. Thanks for listening. So this is another way to say it. This is a quote. So this is a quote that was in the original manual that we got from the Unitarian ministers that originated this manual, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But I love this quote. This is a photograph of a Sanctuary Everywhere protest that AFSC helped to put on. Actually, it was the idea of a high school student who didn't have the infrastructure to have 2,000, 3,000 people show up for a march. So he reached out to AFSC and we helped him organize it. And it was a really powerful thing. It was in opposition to the Muslim ban. So I want to just read this quote. We can already recognize that today time is split between a present that is already dead and a future that is already living. And the yawning abyss between them is becoming enormous. In time, sorry, I'm having trouble seeing behind my things here. An event will thrust us like an arrow into that living future. This will be the real political act of love. That's Antonio Negri. And that we are standing in the gap between an unjust past and hopefully a more just future, and standing in the gap between the pain of those impacted by injustice and trying to create some space of sanctuary and safety and transition to justice. So that's really what we're up to. So I'm going to talk just briefly about where this came from. So AFSC, when I began my work with AFSC and some other efforts to do, to sort of be in deeper relationship with the Quaker community, we originally were like, okay, we're going to just like provide lists of things you can do around certain issues, and then Quakers will do it. And there are some incredible activists and incredible people doing incredible work in the Quaker community, But what we found is that mostly there was we were organized to support individual ministries and not collective ministries. And so that got us sort of looking around. And we also really wanted to do something that addressed this divide between mystics and activists in the context of our meetings and our congregations. And so Jen Piper, who is the interfaith organizer in Denver for AFSC, connected us to Kelly Dignan and Kirsten Homblatt in particular, who worked with Deborah Holder to create the original social change ministry. And they were inspired by Parker Palmer's Circles of Trust. So it does have some Quaker origins. And then they really sat with, what does it mean to accompany immigrants in a way that's humble, that's impactful, that sets their leadership at the forefront? And how do you do that centering the spirit as well? And so they created this model, and then they handed it to us. We went and saw what they were doing. They said, take it, build it out if you want. We'd love it to be circulated more broadly. And so that's how it got sort of turned into Quaker Social Change Ministry. And we continue to work with the Unitarians on this kind of model and teaching it and teaching accompaniment. And we really want to root our activism in the spirit and, as I said, create beloved community as we work for social change, so we have a lived and embodied experience of what justice feels like, so we can create it in the world. We really wanted to bring AFSC and Quakers together to work side by side for justice, and AFSC centers the communities most impacted by justice in our work, and so we wanted to teach Quakers how to do that also. And so that's where the principles come from. And this is a Unitarian congregation, I think in Denver, that we're hearing. So what we started with was the kind of core and the beginning of the process, which is creating a conversation with your small group as you gather together about what it is that you need from each other in order to really do this deep and powerful and sometimes risky work together. And so here's some samples. So what it's called in the model, but this is not, you can call it shared agreements. If covenant is not the term that works for you, you're welcome to use other terms. But I like the term covenant in terms of having a sense of we are committed and connected to each other, and as we covenant together, as we are committed and connected to each other in our shared work, these are our principles and these are what we're trying to aspire to be with and toward each other. So this is one sample, be as fully present as possible. So you all came up with really wonderful suggestions in the first thing. You really began and leaned into this work, thinking about conflict, thinking about how to do that. So here's a sample of one. We actually don't recommend that you take one that already exists and just use it. The process of creating this together is really important. So be as fully present as possible, assume positive intent on the part of fellow participants, listen with resilience, refrain from interrupting others, set your own boundaries for personal sharing, speak personal truths in ways that respect other people's truth, no fixing, no saving, no advising, and no setting each other straight. When the going gets tough, turn to wonder. I love that one. Observe deep confidentiality, which you all will need to really work out with each other. What that means is that, like, if I hear a story, can I share the story but not who told it? Or do I really need to not share any of the details? Like, really be specific about that, and commit to regular attendance. So that's an example. There are more in the manual that I'm going to show you at the end. There are more samples of this that can help to stoke your thinking about this. But the biggest content is the people themselves, to be able to say to each other, this is what I need from you. This is what I want from you. This is not intended to be creedal. It's not intended to be fixed. As you work with each other, there may be things you need to add. There may be things that don't seem to fit anymore. So it's really just like Quaker faith and practice. It's an ongoing living document that you will turn to and think about as you proceed. The way it's used is that you read it at the beginning of each meeting as the first thing that you do, to remind each other of what it is that you're up to, what you're trying to do together. So that's covenant. So I'm going to do the outline for a meeting, and then I'm going to open it up for questions for this part, and then I'm going to go deeper into other parts of the spiritual practice. So as I said, you open the meeting by reading the group covenant aloud. Take 5 minutes for that. You do centering worship, which can be, if open worship is not your practice, you do whatever centering worship works for your congregation, for the people that are gathered together. If you're in a more programmed worship, Quaker worship setting or program worship setting, you can do a little program worship here. Then you do individual check-ins. Those are really important. And in all of the contexts that I've done collective work, having a chance for people to share what it is they're bringing, to let it go, to say where they are spiritually, to share something important that's just happened, or a sorrow or a joy that they're carrying, is a really critical moment to enter the space fully, to be present with each other fully, to let go what was just happening so that you can be with each other. The next is a spiritual practice. And the spiritual practice, the way that we think about it and teach it is something that engages your body. So it can be chanting together. Sometimes people might do Lectio Divina, but it's something that will engage all of you. I'm going to do this later. We're going to sing a song together. So something that, it can be really simple, singing a song, walking meditation, chanting. And often what happens in the groups is people bring spiritual practices. It could be yoga, some kind of meditation like that. They bring a spiritual practice that has been important for them, and they share that with the group and lead it. And that's another way to sort of personally show up and be vulnerable to share something that's important to you. So that's the next piece. The next part is storytelling, and we're going to go a little deeper into that as we proceed through the webinar. I have, as a storyteller, I have found how important and critical it is that people share their stories with each other, that this is, especially in the context of Quaker faith, that our stories are the bread of our lives. Our stories are what we bring. In my experience teaching spiritual storytelling in a lot of contexts, what I found is that when people share what's vulnerable and what's close to their heart, that and as people respond to those stories, that those stories become really kind of their own liturgy or their own sense of the shared narrative of the group. And those things are really important. And in this case, we're advising that you share a story about your work together, about trying to do activism, about the kind of thing that you're working on together, that you share that story and then let the group reflect on it. The last thing is group reflection. You might begin, you might move into worship at the end as well. And these aspects are really critical. And there's just as in Quaker Meeting for Business, there's a kind of adage that if you have a long agenda, you need to worship longer so that you can be fully present for the work that you have ahead of you. The understanding is that this is a time to be connected with one another spiritually, to center the spirit in your work, and that when you really take this time, like self-care or meditation or anything that like centers and grounds the group, that when you take that time, you're going to be able to turn to your work with more open hearts and in a more of a sense of resilient connection. And so it's really important. And there's a story that this practice was used by the Racial Justice Committee of Central Philadelphia monthly meeting. And one person who really participated in that said that they had a meeting and they had a huge long agenda. And for a moment they thought, well, let's set aside the spiritual practice before we go to it and let's get our agenda. They said, no, let's do it. And the spiritual practice was really deep, very, very grounding. And their business went much quicker than they expected. So it's an opportunity to really ground with each other, be present for one another, and then be able to be present for someone else. So I'm going to pause there for a moment for questions. And I did see something in the chat you're welcome to raise your hand, or you can put it in the chat. I have both open here so I can see it. Somebody, Joseph put in a quote here. So one person, Bob said, I love that poem, very lyrical, very clear and well-spoken, thank you. And Joseph put in a quote, individuals can denounce and resist a way of life. Only a community can live a way of life into being and then bequeath it to succeeding generations. That's beautiful. That's Jim Corbett, who was a Quaker who was part of the founders of the first sanctuary movement. And then Alex asked something which I think is important. I hope it's okay to bring it into the group. What if someone else's truth is that they know how a large group like an ethnic group think? How does one best bring the person to their personal experience and beliefs? It's a really, really great question. I think that that's part of the guidelines. And I think that in terms of holding each other in a way where you're inviting each other into deeper community, into deeper covenant, and also to be closer to living closer to the best of who we can be. So if somebody's personal truth is oppressive to another body, an ethnic group, then it's problematic truth, right? And probably isn't really true, and not based on real lived experience with that person. And so then I think that lovingly challenging that, offering, speaking in I statement, saying that's not true for me. I think it's really important for the safety of the community that we be willing to challenge each other to grow in our understanding and in our experience. So I appreciate that question very much. So Joseph has another comment. My experience with Outreach, Peace, and Justice Committee is that when we are constrained by time, our meeting moves from spirit-led to agenda-driven. Yes. And so this outline that I've just showed you, actually, it's a lot, it's full. And so often when Quaker social change ministry groups are beginning, they take a lot of time. They really do learn there's a whole section of the manual that talks about group formation, the stages of group formation, and how to take your time with it. And there's a suggestion that you have a retreat early so that you can really get connected to one another. And so really being really clear that you're going to take the time for spiritual work and not just try and get things done is a really important part of the practice. And it deepens both the connection and the way that you're going to show up. So I mean, I think there's one group that I'm a part of that uses this document by Tima Oken about white supremacy culture. And we have referenced it. And at the end of our meetings, we say, how did those patterns show up in our meeting? And one of those is a sense of urgency, that we're trying to get things done and that we don't take enough space and time for one another and to make space. I mean, I'm actually trying to model right now in this meeting, not being okay, let's get this done. I have in mind what I'm trying to present, but I'm trying to model a kind of open presence and that there's enough of that our time together is abundant and we can be present with each other while we're doing this. Are there any other questions? Karen, are you raising your hand again, or is that an old hand raising? If you're raising your hand again, feel free to unmute and ask a question. And if you're not, you can click that button and unraise your hand. Any other questions or comments? Great, thank you. We'll move on if I can get to here we go. So we're going to do a spiritual practice. I'm going to talk about it. I think I talked a little bit about it already. So just as meeting for worship is a way, sorry, I need to move my things around so I can see everything. For most friends, whoops. That's not what I wanted to do. So for most friends, meeting for worship is just one way to experience spirituality and express it. And so a spiritual practice is another way that you do it outside of meeting for worship that feeds your soul. And like I said, the examples are writing activities. So something that really involves your you're indifferent, something like I would handwrite, not type, guided meditation, walking meditation, chanting, singing, making art. That's something that can be really wonderful just to draw for a little bit. Nature activities. I've heard of people like sharing photos and like talking about what they saw in them. And again, it's a participatory activity with the group being led and doing the spiritual together. So I am going to, we're going to sing a song together, and it's up to you if you want to. I'd love it if you would unmute and sing with me. But if you, and I'm not a great singer, but I'm going to go ahead and do this. But if you feel more comfortable just singing in your own space, that is really okay as well. And let me look at the chat real quick, and then we'll sing. Emphasis on emotional contact with members of the meeting support. I don't see a place for the analysis of the problem of social injustice that the group is confronting. This requires not subjective awareness, but analysis. So a lot of that, Charles, is going to be in the context of the second session on this, which is really an analysis that's rooted in the community, rooted in relationship with the community. So it still has emotional content, it's still relationship based, but it does derive from people's direct experience and their analysis about their own circumstances and situation. So it's a little different from the like broader political analysis. It's trusting the people you're working with to have an analysis about their own circumstances and the way out of them. But we'll talk a lot more about that in the second session. So we'll sing together. I hear some people did unmute themselves. This is a song by the Peace Poets, and which is particularly related to the rights movement, of course. So, and if you have a better voice than me, feel free to pipe in and really. So I'm going to sing it once, and then we'll sing it together. Hoy mi gente traemos la fuerza, la libertad es la única bandera. Rise up, my people, my condors, my eagles. No human being can ever be illegal. All right, sing it with me. Hoy mi gente traemos la fuerza. La libertad es la única bandera. Rise up, my people, my condor, my eagle. No human being can ever be illegal. Let's do it one more time. It's funny because there's a delay with what you, in my hearing you probably, and you hearing each other. So it's funny. But hoy mi gente traemos la fuerza, la libertad es la única bandera. Rise up, my people, my condor, my eagle. No human being can ever be illegal. Yeah, thanks. Yay. Thank you. And this is a photograph from the Interfaith Service from Love Knows No Borders, which you can see in the background. These were amazing singers that were singing at that. But I think that gives you a sense of like something different where you really are in your body, and that shifts energy and gets you sort of to be able to be present. So we're going to talk next about storytelling. With storytelling, what you want to do, this is a photograph from a dinner at the corporation last year for alumni, and people were sharing their stories about their experiences with AFSC. It was really a pretty powerful event. But it gives you a sense of sitting in a circle, listening to each other, hearing one another's experience. So for the storytelling, you're going to try sharing an experience that you are still processing and learning from, that you would like feedback on, that connected you to something greater than yourself, the spirit, a community or a movement, was challenging, frustrating, or upsetting, was joyful, transformative, or encouraging, and reminded you why you are passionate about your group's focus. So the idea is to share stories that are really connected with what it is you're up to together. When I was in Colorado and saw this done by Unitarian congregation, the woman who shared, she was accompanying an immigrant woman and her child. And one of the ways that she was supporting is by childcare, taking care of the woman's child while the woman could go and do things. And she actually, this is related to the analysis comment. So she noticed that the woman that she was supporting was had some fines. Like I don't know if they were traffic fines, some fines that were kind of exorbitant. And the woman she was supporting figured out, like, raised the money so she could pay the fines, and was really grateful and relieved that she had done it. And the woman who was supporting her was outraged that these fines had been imposed on her, and she wanted to go down to the city hall and try and change the policy or get something done differently. But the woman she was supporting didn't want that. She was really grateful that she was able to get it done and pay it off, and she really wanted the woman was supporting her to offer childcare. So that was a really powerful story about being, like, having humility to let yourself be led by somebody. And even though you may think something is wrong, that you follow the lead of the people that you're supporting in terms of what their priorities are. This is an example of this followership, which we'll talk about a lot more. But in Colorado, there are, I think, or I don't know if there still are, but there were 4 women in sanctuary that they felt like sanctuary is a dead end, that it's voluntary incarceration. Ingrid, who has been in sanctuary there, just had a baby in sanctuary, which is not what she was hoping for. So they started to think about policy and the policy changes that they wanted, which is called the People's Resolution. And so they asked their faith-based allies to support them in getting that policy to be enacted, which would really give them relief so that they wouldn't have to be in sanctuary. So that's just an example of that kind of thing. There are stories, I'm sure, about that. But anyway, the storytelling is really about sharing a vulnerable story, a story as you're in the midst of it, that you're grappling with, but that you want to hear the reflection of your community about, that can deepen your own, the group's sense of how to do this work together. And then there are queries, and this is a really important part. The story is really important. The sharing of the stories, the sharing of multiple different people sharing stories over time. In the setting, you're going to have one person share a story and then people respond to it. You're not going to try and have a lot of people tell a story in one session. And then the queries for storytelling are what feelings came up for you in that moment. What did you feel in your body as you shared that story? We find that paying attention to the body can be a window to the spirit. Did this experience connect you to something greater than yourself, another person, community, spirit, God, the light? Did you gain a new realization or insight? How does your experience relate back to the tenets of accompaniment? So we're going to do that in the next session. There's these really wonderful tenets of accompanying for social change that we'll review. How does the experience relate to that? In what ways does the experience relate to how you see spirit at work in other aspects of your life, in the life of your meeting church and other people's lives? And how might this experience impact your social justice work, your life as a whole? And so you're obviously not going to use all these queries each time you tell a story. Usually there will be somebody who is sort of holding the space for the storyteller and then inviting the other people in the group to reflect, and they will ask some of these queries. But it's a real way, again, as for those stories to really become shared and for people to learn from one another's experience, and to grow together in their own experience. I'm gonna see if any of you have any questions at this time. Okay.
Well, one comment it might be helpful. I know we want to get a lot in an hour and a half, but to have little pauses between some of the ideas and let it settle in a little, almost like a little silence.
Sure, we can do that. actually, let's go ahead and do that right now. And Michael, did you have a question or a comment that you wanted to make? And then we'll settle into quiet. And then I'm actually gonna, out of that silence, I'm gonna tell you a story. So Michael, do you wanna?
Yes, it's Ginny. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Janine. Sorry.
It's okay. I'm taking notes furiously, excuse me, but I'm wondering, are you going to have, or will we be able to get this in some sort of PDF form that we'll be able to print out your slides?
Yeah, I'll post my slides on the Quaker Social Change Ministry page. These are all, most of the content of the slides come from the Quaker Social Change Ministry manual, which is a 50-page manual that has all this content in it that at the end of this time, I will show you how to get there. I will show you how to find the recording of this and the slides, which I'll post in the next day or so. So yes.
Thank you.
And feel free to use the slides, to share them with other people. We really want to spread this model. As long as you tell where you got it, we're fine with you using it however you want. We really want the model to be used and for other people to learn about it as well. So let's settle into a little silence, and then out of that silence, I'm going to tell you a story, and we'll use these questions for reflection. So. So I'm going to tell you a story about the Love Knows No Borders action that I have written about this, but this is a little more raw. This version that I'm going to share with you. So the Love Knows No Borders action was in San Diego in December, and there were, I think, 400 faith leaders that gathered in San Diego to be a part of this action, which was in response to the migrant caravans, and also immediately in response to some tear gas that was thrown at migrants, I think the week before. And it was an action that was pulled together by FSC staff like in 3 weeks. And the intent was to support the migrant caravan and to gain visibility for the level of support and having faith leaders do that. So that's just some context. So the day of the protest, we gathered at the very beginning of in a parking lot where there was a press conference, and different faith leaders shared their perspective. And then we gathered and we marched in 2 lines as faith leaders, some with banners across the beach. It was kind of muddy, down to the beach. And there was, when we got to the beach, the waves were crashing, and there were people that were faith leaders that wanted to bless people. And I guess the part that I want to say is that they wanted to anoint them. So there was water and there was oil. And in some ways it was just like this total act of grace and love. And in some ways, in some cases, there wasn't a lot of care around who was getting blessed. And so there were on occasion Muslim people who had crosses put on their forehead. And as one of the people that was helping to organize this was like, in the moment, it was both very, very moving, and it was a little bit troubling. and later afterwards, we heard from some people about like, wait, this was not sensitive about the multiracial space that we were, multi-faith space that we were in. And then we walked from there, and there were, one of the things that was really moving is that the local and national Council for American Islamic Relations was really a part of it. And they wanted to be at the forefront. They were waiting for a moment to express their solidarity with the migrant caravans. And so they were really like willing to stand very close to the front and be a part of it. And there was a way in which like supporting that leadership was really important, as well as like a sense that like white allies should be like taking the brunt of this at the same time. But I think that there was a negotiation around that and some sense of not wanting to constrain people's support for the way that they wanted to participate in the action. And then we got to the front of the line, and those of us who were willing to risk arrest stood at the front, and I offered a prayer, and then a blessing. We were standing, so we were greeted by 30 CBP officers who were in riot gear. Our intent was to walk to the border wall and to offer a blessing to the migrants on the other side, but they greeted us about 100 feet away from there and stopped us from being able to proceed to the border wall. And they greeted us in riot gear with bully clubs. And I was very scared. I was shaking, and I made the blessing, and I poured the water on the ground. And then I handed it to other faith leaders to also give a blessing. And then at one point, those of us who were in the front were facing right across from these Border Patrol agents, and we kneeled down. And when we kneeled down, there was kind of this reaction from the Border Patrol where they took a breath and they stepped back because we were making ourselves even more vulnerable by kneeling before them. And we stood there and sang for a long time. We sang different songs, including the one that I just taught you. And then after an hour or so, there were different encounters with the Border Patrol. And then I remember looking out, and I think one of the people that was an arrestable sort of took a step forward, and there were different police, different officers that showed up, and they had zip ties, and I'm like, oh, we're going to get arrested. And so they reached in and they arrested us. They arrested me, and about 32 others of us. And I think that the thing that I reflect upon is just the sort of the sense of that vulnerability, but also the sense of like being an organizer and having all of these tensions in the midst of this thing. And so we were arrested, and I was in a police van for 2 hours until they let us go. So there were several of us in a police van, and then we were written citations, and then we were released. So the thing that I hold is the way that there is, as you're one of the organizers and holding some space for something like this, the different immediate choices, like the choice about allowing the blessing. And I think that wasn't fully discerned, the choice about, who was in the front and how to navigate that. And there are, I think, as those of us who participate, there are lots of different questions that we hold and different ways that we might have done this. So that I still hold that in my mind and feel grateful to have been able to participate in this action, but also hold all of the tensions of what we might have done differently as well. And also just the way in which I think this was perceived as supportive, and there was a lot of press that happened, but I also like hold like how do we really, really center our actions deeply and really deeply in what the community that is most impacted by this stuff is asking for. And so I still am holding that around this particular action. So if you feel like it, I'd love for folks to, so there's a question here. Is there a book with this in it? Yes, there's a book, a 50-page manual, and I'll show you that. I can also, if you like, share a written story about that action. But I share that in a much more vulnerable way with you as a modeling of the kind of storytelling that we might want to do. So I'd love for you to reflect, and feel free to raise your hand. Feel free to put something in the chat. And there's these questions that it would be great if I would love to know what feelings came up for you in the moment. I mean, if for you to share that or for me to share that. So for me, the feelings that came up were a little bit of like wanting in my activist practice to pay attention to my body so that because it's going to help me make really good decisions. So that's one thing that I say. Joseph says, great story. Gandhi prepared for 15 years for the Salt March, and recommends the Gandhian iceberg on social change and modern day Satyagraha. Sorry, So other reflections or thoughts about the story, feel free to answer any of these questions. I mean, or you can ask me. And I can answer what ways this experience relates to, I mean, it relates very deeply to how I see the spirit in terms of collective action, in terms of support for the migrant community. But if you want to ask questions, feel free. Or have any comments, feel free to put them in the chat. Minga asked, do we hold our actions to the community being impacted or to God or both? This is a really wonderful question. So my sense in this practice is that that I find God in the people who are most, I find God in the people who are most impacted by injustice. And I think that for me, I mean, as somebody impacted by the spiritual tradition of Jesus, I would say that there's a real sense like Jesus accompanied the poor. Jesus accompanied the people that were being oppressed. And so I think that there's a real covenantal and relationship, and when you walk with people who are impacted by injustice, and you humble yourself to their agenda around getting out of their situation, there is a real deep sense of encountering God, for me at least. Kristen has asked, how did your group include the ideas, feelings, needs of the people you are attempting to accompany and impact? That's a really, really important question. So the San Diego AFSC office is deeply, deeply connected to the immigrant community and has walked with the immigrant community for a long, long time. And the idea for this came from the director of that program, who was centering the needs of people impacted, and was, when we said, what can faith leaders, what can people of faith do? The sense was that this would be perceived as supportive and in conversation with people that were immigrants. And there were other ideas about how to support immigrants at that time, some of which people felt very uncomfortable with, that could have put immigrants in more risk. And there was we had staff in Tijuana who were in constant communication. There were lots of adjustments to the actions to ensure that we would not put the immigrants on the other side of the wall in harm's way at all. And so I think that we were really keeping in mind the migrants that we were trying to support, and in conversation and in deep ways. And I think that ideally these calls will come directly from the immigrant community. This is what we need you to do. And in many ways, this action did come that way. We need support. But I think that ideally that's how you're getting the call. Karen says, Paul said, lay hands quickly on no person. Good advice. I don't think I understand the question. But Charles asks, how did this action relate to the wider movement for social justice for migrants? How was the strategy determined? Really good question. So AFSC has a long-term, we have an Abolish ICE campaign that we're part of that's obviously bigger than us. We're also part of the Defund Hate campaign, which is also about abolishing ICE, defunding the Border Patrol. And also no militaries and it's about demilitarizing the border. So the demands arose, and those campaigns are both very much deeply immigrant-led. The Defund Hate campaign is a multi-organization campaign, but very deeply immigrant-led. And so all of the demands that we were making, which were to stop deportations, to defund ICE, to demilitarize the border, came from that movement. So they were very carefully discerned, and we very carefully trained people in how to be spokespeople about that really quickly. And Karen, if you want to unmute, I really don't understand your question. So if you want to ask it to the group, that would be really great. Or if you want to say more in the chat, that would be okay too. My husband and I worked in Palestinian territories during the Second Intifada. Just going through checkpoints daily to work and our daughter's school is difficult. As we were prepared to return to peace building, we feel our challenges will include overcoming anger. Yes, very, very, very important. And it was hard in that moment facing the Border Patrol to not feel enraged at them. I think in some ways anger fueled what we were doing, and a sense of solidarity in the way that people were being treated. And I think that, but we needed to be channeling those feelings in such a way that we were providing an effective witness against what it is we were opposed to. And I think that one of the things that was really moving and very surprising is that there was one person in that group that was looking at a Border Patrol agent, and they started to cry. They started to cry in that moment, which was really very surprising and very, but also like an example of the vulnerability and the power of nonviolence in the face of deep injustice. And and many of the people that are Border Patrol agents are immigrants themselves. So it's, sort of out of the system. And I think one of the stories that I'll probably tell in the next webinar, but I was very moved by is being, well, actually, I'm not going to tell the story. I'll tell this other one. I was in Gaza in May of 2014, right before Operation Protective Edge. And I had this really powerful experience in the 2 to 3 days that we were there, relating to youth in Gaza and being moved. We had like a dinner near the beach that just felt like breaking bread with, a spiritual community. It was very, very powerful. Came back to the United States, and Gaza was bombed. I'd never experienced the impact of knowing people, being friends with people who were being bombed. And during the 51 days of Operation Protective Edge, I got up every morning and looked at my Facebook to see if any of my friends had been hurt. One of the people I met was killed in Operation Protective Edge. But I gained a really deeper sense that if there was a way that I could put my body in the way of this thing, I would. And I think that that was a really helpful moment in terms of knowing the risk I might be willing to take, but also feeling deeply connected to people who were facing directly injustice. But Karen, if you want to say something, you had your thing unmuted for a second. Feel free to unmute and say any more about that.
Yes, my husband's also listening in, and I just want to say we share your emotions. We lived there. Oh, we were 6.5 years there, but probably 4.5 years of that were the Second Intifada. And it was just very difficult. You kind of have to face your idealistic ideas about your own country.
Yep.
And our unwitting or whatever parts in the oppression of a people. And it's very difficult. So of course it's one of the challenges too is to pray for and love your enemy. We're preparing to go back and do something. We did do some peace work over there. With a friend, we started a international checkpoint watch, but there's just so many challenges.
Yeah.
So many. And sometimes we were misunderstood by Palestinians, and they would kind of say, do something, and you were just trying to be a buffer, but you were very limited in terms of trying to be nonviolent.
Yeah.
And it's not easy.
And there's a political solution, and so I think that's really hard. And especially when, we're implicated in terms of our taxes and US policy, clearly. So
Yes.
it's really hard. And I think one of the things that was really powerful, disturbing was that I came back and the 51-day war happened, and then Mike Brown was killed in August. And I came from that experience to see the United States in a really different way, to see colonialism as a force, to see racism and white supremacy as so endemic, and that these struggles are really connected, and that it's important to keep them together, and to really hold a deep systemic analysis as we do our best to stand with the people who are most suffering from that. And just like Ingrid and the immigrants that were in sanctuary who said, you need to help us change policy, to really listen to what is going to make the biggest remedies. And often there's a new book by Ibram Kendi called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And the way that he defines an anti-racist is somebody who is using language to uphold and support justice and equity, and whose work centers on shifting policy so that justice can be served, so that's fair and anti-racist, which I think is good. So Martha asks, did you do anything with the trauma after the border incident as a group? We did have some conversations, but I think that we could have done more. And I think that as we process that, I think there could have been, get more gatherings together and really talking about the experience. A lot of people wrote about it, and that was my way of dealing with the trauma was to sort of say what my experience was it with. But I think that this is a really important piece in terms of how we are doing our work together, or how these Quaker social change ministry groups work, is to come together to share your experience, share the impact of, if you're, I mean, I know people who do this work and they accompany immigrants, for example, to ICE check-ins, and then people get deported. It's very, very painful. It's not, you really do have, your trauma is not the same as the family, but you do have, when you start to care about people, you're going to be impacted too. So having a way to process that is really important, and that's sort of built into the model in terms of created community. Joseph says, great definition of racism. Racism, I like it too. I think it's a really good one. That anti-racism is a act. So Carl says, given Keith Helmut's observation, there is a growing sense that to continue representing the ecological issue in our corporate forums as a special interest is to remain unresponsive to a central spiritual task of our time, readapting human settlement and economic behavior to the biotic integrity of Earth. Keith is very good at big words. The ecological situation is not a concern in the usual sense of the word, nor is it a special interest. It is the foundation of all concerns and the most general and comprehensive interest possible. I think that's a really interesting observation. It's interesting because I'm really interested in tangent, but I think it's related in terms of us doing yes. So I think about, like, when these systems of injustice are interlocking, and many people would put climate justice at the forefront. For me, if you ended colonialism and you ended white supremacy, you would end climate change too. And so I put something different at the very beginning of that, because I think that what happened in the process of colonialism is that we disrupted indigenous economic systems, which were much more in line with and much more responsive and holding the earth in common. And so I think that for me, that's a really important framework to keep in mind. I read this wonderful book, which I'll talk more about in our next session, by a Quaker, Mary Watkins, who's a member of Santa Barbara meeting, called Mutual Accompaniment and the Creation of the Commons. She's a really big advocate for this model of accompaniment. And the way that she talks about it is that we're restoring right relationship. That when Europeans came to North America, Quakers included, we were colonizing North America, and indigenous people said, come and share. And they had an understanding that we were sharing the commons as they understood it. And instead were extracting and enacting genocide and doing that kind of thing in these and so we were not operating out of right relationship in relation to indigenous peoples. And so she talks about accompaniment as a way to restore right relationship that Europeans pretty much screwed up a lot in colonization. And in that process, you can move back to the sense of commons, and that through this accompaniment practice, it's a pathway to decolonization and to deeper relationship with one another. That's a great question. I wonder if anyone has tried to follow the leadings, voices, needs of the non-human creation. So in that book, Mary has a whole chapter on accompanying the living earth in particular. So it's a great question, and there's the whole chapter on it. And Martha said, did I hear you say dealing with trauma is in the booklet? There's a lot of that's a great question. There's a lot of group formation and the kind of way to keep a cohesive community. It's not directly dealt with in the manual, but there are some resources that I would refer you to. I think that the practice of opening space for people's experience to be shared can really help with trauma. but it's not necessarily direct. But I can certainly refer people to some other resources. The Body Keeps the Score is obviously the sort of standard book. There's also a really wonderful book called My Grandmother's Hands, which is about dealing with the trauma of racism. Andrew asks, are the queries listed for you as the speaker to reflect on, which is how they are written? I noticed that you're being asked questions about the event rather than giving our own reflections, reactions. Are there queries for the listeners as well? So, so these are written for the storyteller, but I think they can be, I think that the questions can apply to you too. And I believe there's a set of questions that are specifically for the listener. If there isn't, I will put them in. But the same kinds of questions, like as you respond to this story, how does it land in your body? I think are really important. When you hear the story, do you feel connected to something greater than yourself? That response can be really helpful. When I teach spiritual storytelling, I have people offer praise, which is honor that of God in the story, to offer what you heard that you really believe is reflective of God in the story. And that can be really helpful, reflective practice. But all of these questions can be turned so that they can be referencing the listeners as well. And I appreciate these stories because I appreciate all these questions. I want you to be able to grapple with what it is I'm talking with in a multidimensional way. So I'm acting as the storyteller and you reflecting, and then I'm also acting as the facilitator of this thing. But in this practice, you would have much more sort of mindful and intentional facilitation to keep the focus on the storyteller, on the specific story, and on these kinds of reflections in response to the question. Carl says, my thought experiment was the last bit, the question. I wonder if anyone has tried to follow. Yes, I did hear it. I did see it later. Joseph says, indigenous economic systems were introduced to insane ideas about ownership. Yes, they were. And rather than the commons. Great, thank you so much. All right, let's see. Yep, we have only a few more minutes. Thank you for your questions and your comments. I appreciate that. So I'm gonna read this sort of long quote here around the beloved community and around creating it, which is what this practice, the practices that I've just talked about, is about. It isn't about being the perfect community, but about being the beloved community. Dr. King had a vision, a dream that people could come together with a shared commitment to reconciliation and overcoming barriers, to rejecting racism, injustice, and violence. That sounds like a utopian vision, and many see it that way. But Dr. King didn't advocate for expect the eradication of all the difference and difficulties of being human. He believed that only the love of God was powerful enough to overcome hate and injustice and fear, and to bring flawed human beings together. That's the beloved community. People who believe deeply that they are loved by God, and that everyone around them is loved by God too. People who believe this deeply enough that it shapes who they are and how they live their lives, and how they deal with their own and each other's brokenness. So that's from Being the Beloved Community by Reverend Janet Roberts and Duggins. That's what this is about. It's about being vulnerable with each other. It's about being present with each other as we learn this deep spiritual practice of accompaniment. So that is the last slide. Joseph said being broken open. Yes. I'm gonna pause there if you have any questions or comments right now. Love to take them. This is a lot of content that I've given you and offered. I'd love to hear anything that you have to say. If you want to just hold it, I'll just leave a little bit of silence for a moment in case you have something that rises, and then I'll move to the last thing. So I want to show you the resources, and this email address is where you can find it all. afsc.org/QSCM. And I'm going to show you that in just a second. So here's this page. So a lot of the material I've talked about is here. The goals, there's a way to contact me and say that you want to join when we reignite or restart up a cohort where I'll be having calls with people who are doing this practice. You can join there. There's another webinar that's a shorter one. It's 90 minutes that has the whole thing, but we'll be posting these 2 webinars as well. There's a little short introduction that's 2 pages that if you want to like share this idea with other people, you're welcome to use. The big piece that's here is the manual, which is this long document. Includes the poem. It includes a lot of the resources that I've shared with you tonight. It also includes tips on getting ready and preparing the group, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the manual. Feel free to download it and use it and share it. I can take a few questions. We have enough time that I can take 1 or 2 questions. I really appreciate you being here and being willing to take this on and learn this practice. So sorry, let's see, there's a chat. Somebody has offered a comment. So Andrew says, I wonder about the relationship between the methodology you list here and the experience of a direct leading. I agree that one can find God in the communities that we support, but that's not quite the same as how we discern one's own leading. Rex Ambler's Experiments in Light sets out a group-guided meditation which may suggest an approach to discerning individual and group leading. Yes, it does. This isn't what this is about. This is about a learning and accompaniment practice, which I believe is really deeply relational, deeply spiritual. If one is grappling with one's own leading, which could include learning accompaniment practice, then these other practices of clearness committees or finding a direct leading are what they would do. I don't want to pretend that this model is that, but I have found in my own life, the more and more that I have embraced the principles of accompaniment and I guess I'm going to use this religious language, yoke my will and my orientation and my priorities to people that are much more directly impacted by injustice. The deeper my spiritual practice grows, the deeper my faithfulness grows, the deeper my capacity to speak and understand injustice grows. Joseph says, my experience is that leadings are deeply personal. Quite often there is no map. You proceed as the way opens. Yes. And I want to really say that the spiritual practice and the spiritual community that you're forming with those of you who are learning to accompany, you're going to have real senses of the spirit breaking in. That's how it's set up. That's the idea, is that as you learn this practice, you're going to find that more and more. And there's a real intentionality about setting up a deeply spiritual community in order to do that work. So I'm going to see if anybody else has their hand raised or wants to say anything. I'd love to end with some worship, and I really am grateful for you all being here. I believe in this practice. I practice it, try and practice it in my life. In a day-to-day way. I believe in its power. I believe in that if we had this kind of small group doing justice work in most of Quaker congregations and in others, that we could really do some deep transformative work. So there's one question, this is probably off topic, but I've been wondering lately why colonialism always won and still wins. Yeah, I mean, in the wake of Bolivia, that's a big question. Are colonialists stronger? Is racist capitalism the strongest force in the history of humans? I wonder if the answers to these questions impact on accompaniment and social change work. We need to understand the context and the history in order to be effective, don't we? Yes, we do. And I mean, I wonder that all the time right now. like our colony, are we going to lose? Are we losing? But I have been moved by, I mean, to deeply answer this question, I would suggest mutual accompaniment and the creation of the commons. There's a thing that she ends that book with, which I think is really powerful. She tells a story about how the autonomous community, well, one thing she talks about is the Zapatistas, people coming there from North America, learning about their work, and the Zapatistas sitting them down and saying, okay, we can't expand our work unless you change policy in your country. Go back and do that work. Go and change policy. So that's an example of accompaniment. But what she tells a story about is that there's a new autonomous community, I think it was in the early 2000s, that the Zapatistas founded. And when they founded this community, they made a huge mural that depicted a decolonial, anti-racist world that they wanted to live in, where care of the earth was primary. They painted this mural, beautiful mural, and within 48 hours, it was destroyed by the military. And instead of just falling into despair, they made a call. They called for that mural to be replicated all across the world. There are replicas of that mural in Oakland, in San Francisco, in Toronto, in very many places. There's a replica of that mural on the border wall in Nogales. That is a call out to envisioning this alternative world. My own sense is that as we repair relationships, as we get deeper and more resilient relationships, that we have a strength that can overcome oppression. I mean, it's what my work on, my life on. It's hard because when you aren't afraid of using force and impacting and genocide as a tool, your ability to shape the world is greater. But I have to believe that through restored relationships and through collective work to believe in and create the world we want, that we can get somewhere. So our time is up. Thank you very, very much for joining me. I hope you will use what's here, and I look forward to greeting you and being with you and talking about this further next week. Thanks very much. Appreciate you all being here. Feel free to write something in the chat as you leave, and you can always reach me at lduncan@afsc.org.